wanted to start off by asking if you'd be able to introduce yourself, and then tell me a little bit about your experience of what is the story for you of the Cradle to Prison pipeline? To you, what is the Cradle to Prison pipeline?
So my name is Marisol Garcia, and I'm the director of the Mental Health Advocacy Program for Kids at Health Law Advocates. And what we know about kids involved in the juvenile justice system is that 70% of them meet the criteria for a mental health diagnosis. And really, lack of access to mental health services is one of the tragedies of the Cradle to Prison pipeline. When we aren't able to allow kids to have access to mental health services, they end up further and further down the pipeline, ultimately ending either in juvenile detention or in prison later on in their lives. And to me, that's a tragedy because it criminalizes mental health needs and doesn't allow for kids to have the connections to their families of origin that they need during the time that they're struggling the most.
Thank you. And what communities do you think are most impacted by this system? I know you mentioned it criminalizes mental health needs. What communities do you think would benefit the most from having access to these mental health services?
I think all communities would benefit from having access to these mental health services, but I think that what we see is that low-income communities are impacted greatly by lack of access to mental health services, and that disproportionately we see kids of color in the juvenile justice system who also have mental health needs that are unaddressed.
And in your work over time, what do you see, what changes have you seen in the Cradle to Prison pipeline, either for the better or for the worse? How has the system improved, or how has the system gotten more harmful or predatory?
So I started out in child welfare in 1995, and I think that there's been a broader discussion since that time about mental health and the way that it is part of the concerns that we have for the kids that are in the juvenile justice system. I mean, I think that when I started, really, the 90s were a really hard time for juvenile justice, and there was a big focus on detention and punishment versus rehabilitation. I think the 90s were a really tough time for that. And I think that we have done a better job at defining the Cradle to Prison pipeline and discussing what points there is a lot of discretion in the juvenile justice system that disproportionately impacts kids of color. And I think that there have been some really terrific things in Massachusetts around access to CBHI services and other services that were as a result of the Rosie D lawsuit that was brought. But we still have a long way to go. We still have, the family resource centers where my attorneys are based out of were created by the legislature to divert kids from juvenile justice who are solely there for because of their unmet mental health needs. And I think that there should be more investment there and in prevention. We are able to serve kids from as young as 2 years old to age 22. And I think that that's terrific. I think there's been some really huge efforts by the legislature also around, justice reform. And I think that's amazing because, the prior jurisdiction to the juvenile court was age 7. And I have arraigned kids as young as 7 and 8 years old, which is crazy. So I think I feel hopeful. I've been here for a long time. I think I feel hopeful. I feel like there's a lot of folks working really hard to do the right thing. And we realize that there's still a long way to go, that we can do better. And in Massachusetts, we should. be doing better. We have the tools. So
it's really exciting to hear. I know that one of the other programs that you mentioned, I think that sort of gearing towards diversion. In our last conversation, you spoke about the juvenile court mental advocacy pilot. And I was wondering if you could speak again a little bit more about that project, or about what impact projects like those in the family resource centers can have on the lives of children, and what's the role of these type of projects in sort of dismantling the cradle-to-prison pipeline.
Definitely. So our program, the Mental Health Advocacy Program for Kids, was evaluated by Boston University School of Public Health. And we had some really terrific data that indicates that our legal advocacy, ensuring that kids receive mental health services in the community, in their homes, and through their school programs, really diverts kids from the juvenile justice system, detention, foster care, really decreases the rates of family stress and parental rates of depression, and also improves the mental health of kids and their caregivers, which ultimately then leads to significantly decreased rates of inpatient psychiatric hospitalization and emergency department usage, and really improving truancy for kids. So really having kids be successful in their homes, in their schools, and in their communities. And the family resource centers were created by the legislature to keep kids out of the juvenile justice system. And so we're really proud to partner with them at providing services, community-based services for families and kids, so that they can be successful and healthy.
Great, thank you. I think it's sort of related to that, on the topic of the juvenile justice systems. I know we spoke a little bit about the courts last time as well. And I know that we spoke about that there seems to be this disconnect between what families or people in general just expect from the courts, and what the courts are actually able to provide, and what the actual power of the courts are. And I was wondering if you'd be able to go into that a little bit more, or maybe talk about the ways that families, or sort of how we can correct that misconception.
Sure.
Yeah, or what you feel would be the most effective way to sort of address that misconception, if that makes sense.
That's a tough misconception to address. I think that there's a lot of folks that share in that misconception. A lot of folks feel that bringing a child to the juvenile court is a place for them to receive support or help. And I think that the juvenile court clinic and other folks that work in the court system really attempt to assist kids when they're there. But I do think that we all know that a child's criminogenic factors go up once they enter through the front door of the courthouse, and they start to think of themselves in a different way, and other folks start to think about them in a different way once they become court involved. I think folks go to the courthouse looking for help, but there's very few things that judges can actually order, and they can't order state agencies to provide services, and they can't wrangle with insurance companies to provide mental health services for families and kids. And so it ends up being a really challenging situation where sometimes the only thing that a judge can do is order custody to the Department of Children and Families, where then a family relinquishes their rights to their child so that their kid can get the mental health services or placement that they need, which isn't right. That someone would have to give up the rights to their child so that they can just get the help that their child needs.
Definitely. Thank you for for your thoughts on that. I think one of the other, you already started to address this earlier, but I'm wondering what your hopes are sort of for the future. What comes after the pipeline is dismantled, and what replaces it? And I know that's not sort of a quick answer, or something that happens in the immediate future, and it's more of a long-term trajectory, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
I think that there is a lot of room in the range of services that we offer families. It's something that I talk about with the attorneys on our team a lot. CBHI services are great, but they're really they are really designed to be shorter term, and some children will need support for much longer, especially during our concerns about COVID-19 and any trauma that kids may experience during the pandemic, during the recovery and post that time. I think there is a concern that during COVID and post-COVID that the barriers to services are intensifying while the need for services goes up. And so I think that there's a lot of room to improve the support that we give families in the community. And that should be a long-term investment and not too far from now, right? From the time that we're actually having this conversation. I think that the legislature is committed to doing that. But I think that there needs to be a big investment there to make sure that we don't have a flood to the court system after the pandemic.
It's a really important point. Yeah, and I think especially now, I think we spoke about it earlier, how the pandemic is sort of bringing to light all of these sort of gaps in the system, all these failures in the system, and really highlighting the areas where there could be greater investment, more needs for services. I think that one of the other our hopes for the website and the way that we use these videos is to make visitors reflect on their own role and their community's role in the Cradle-to-Prison pipeline. And I'm wondering, what sort of questions do you think are important for people to ask themselves in order to sort of properly reflect on their role, or what sort of questions should our website content force people to ask themselves?
I think recently I read something that indicated that we should, when we meet a child for the first time, we should think, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you. And I think that that's really an important place to start. And I think that's often a place that I started when I met kids in the hallways, in jail cells, in institutions for the first time, really trying to dig into what in the history, in the life experience of this child brought them to the moment that I was meeting them in a jail cell or in the hallway of the courthouse. And I think that's what we can all do a little bit better, I think, is to try to understand what experiences families are having that have brought them before the court, and then try to support them around those experiences as best as we can.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I feel like one of the most powerful ways to connect with people is to try and understand their story, try and understand their circumstances, and understand where they're coming from. And it really resonates, I think, with what we hope that part of the work that we're doing in including the returning citizen interviews is to capture these stories and allow folks to tell their own narrative, to tell their own perspective. And not try to dictate that for them, and make that as authentic as possible, and have people's agency really come through.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and I think that was most of sort of the structured questions that I had. And so if there's additional comments that you'd like to make, there's certainly time for that now. I think if you'd like.
I don't know. I don't think I have anything further. I mean, I think that's everything that I guess the only part is that, our program is effective, but it's not everywhere right now.
Right.
Because of economic realities and the way that we're funded through grants and some public dollars. We're currently serving in 7 counties, and I'm really proud of the counties that we serve in, but we're not everywhere. And we're not able to say that we're statewide at this time. I mean, we're in the areas where 87% of kids that are eligible for the service reside, but there's other areas of the state that are also in need, and my program's not there yet.
Yeah. you know, if that is that part of sort of this long-term strategy to at some point also create the funding or the resources to be able to build this into a statewide program, and maybe even the model that other states can. I'm not sure if that's already sort of in the works, whether other states are copying a similar model and trying to implement something.
So what's really exciting is that the American Bar Association asked us to present to the Commission on Homeless and Poverty. And they, as a result of the white paper that we wrote and the presentation that we gave, they are elevating the Map for Kids program as a model for other states to replicate and to adapt for their, for their own jurisdictions.